The first gunshot that rattled through the walls of Madame Prescott's finishing school for young ladies made Viola Harper drop her embroidery hoop. While the other girls screamed and huddled together in the parlor, Viola peered out the window, just in time to see the tall, broad-shouldered man fire another shot into the air, his dark hat tipped low over his eyes as he brought his rearing stallion under control. Arizona Territory, 1878, was no place for the faint of heart. "Get away from that window this instant, Miss Harper." Madame Prescott's voice cracked like a whip across the parlor. A proper young lady never shows curiosity about such vulgar displays. Viola reluctantly stepped back, her cheeks burning with embarrassment as 20 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her. At 19, she should have known better than to show interest in anything beyond her needlework and piano lessons. That's what her stepfather had paid good money for, to transform the headstrong girl he'd inherited through marriage into a docile, marriageable young woman. "Remember your station, Miss Harper," Madame Prescott continued, her thin lips pursed in disapproval. "Keep your head down, your voice soft, and perhaps someday a gentleman might overlook your unfortunate circumstances." The unfortunate circumstances being that Viola was the daughter of a seamstress who had married above her station before dying of fever 3 years ago. Her stepfather, Judge Wilson Harper, had promptly shipped Viola off to finishing school, making it clear she was an unwelcome reminder of his brief marriage. "Yes, madam," Viola murmured, though inside, something rebellious stirred. In the 6 months she'd been at the school in Silver Creek, she'd learned to hide that spark, to walk with her eyes downcast, to speak only when spoken to. But it hadn't extinguished the fire completely. For days later, Viola stood behind the counter of Pritchard's General Store, carefully counting out change for Mrs. Hollis. This was her weekly punishment for having been caught reading a newspaper instead of practicing her French. Madame Prescott believed manual labor would remind Viola of what awaited girls who didn't secure proper marriages. "Thank you, dear Mrs. Hollis said, gathering her purchases. "Give my regards to Madame Prescott." The bell above the door jingled as Mrs. Hollis left, and Viola turned to organize the ribbon display. She was reaching for a fallen spool when the bell rang again, accompanied by the distinctive sound of spurs jangling against wooden floorboards. "Afternoon," came a deep voice that seemed to rumble from somewhere in the vicinity of the ceiling. Viola kept her eyes fixed on the floor, remembering Madame Prescott's constant refrain, "Head down, voice soft." "Good afternoon, sir. How may I help you?" "Well, first you might look at me, so I know I'm talking to a person and not a hat," the man said, amusement warming his tone rather than offense. Startled, Viola glanced up and up further until she met the gaze of the man she'd seen firing shots outside the school. Up close, he was even more imposing, with shoulders that stretched his faded blue shirt and a face weathered by sun and wind. But his eyes were unexpectedly kind, crinkling at the corners as he smiled at her. "That's better," he said. "Hard to have a proper conversation with the top of someone's head." I'm not supposed to," Viola began, then stopped herself. "How may I assist you today, sir?" "Quinn Blackwood," he said, extending a calloused hand across the counter. "Just Quinn to folks around here." "And you are?" Viola hesitated before taking his hand briefly. "Viola Harper." "Miss Viola Harper," he repeated, as if testing the sound of her name. "I need some supplies. New in town, setting up at the old Jennings place about 3 miles out." As she gathered the items on his list, coffee, flour, salt, ammunition, Viola found herself stealing glances at him. He didn't fit her image of the rough cowboys who occasionally passed through town. There was something steady about him, thoughtful even. "You're from Madame Prescott's school, aren't you?" he asked as she wrapped his purchases in brown paper. Viola nodded, tying the package with string. "Thought I recognized you. You were the only one looking out the window when my horse got spooked by that rattler." His smile widened. "Got a curious mind, I take it." "A failing of mine, according to Madame Prescott," Viola replied before she could stop herself. Instead of being shocked by her forthrightness, Quinn Blackwood laughed, a rich sound that seemed to fill the small store. Curiosity's only a failing to those too scared to learn anything new. He placed money on the counter, more than enough for his purchases. "Keep the extra. Consider it payment for looking me in the eye like a human being rather than some wild animal." "I couldn't possibly." "Sure you can." But they don't pay you for working here, do they? Viola shook her head, surprised by his perception. Then it settled. He picked up his packages. Hope to see you again, Miss Viola Harper. And next time, don't be afraid to tell me what you're thinking. Seems to me your thoughts might be worth hearing. The bell jingled as he left, and Viola stood frozen behind the counter, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. No one had ever suggested her thoughts might be worth anything at all. Over the next few weeks, Quinn Blackwood became a regular visitor to the general store on Viola's assigned afternoons. Each time, he would ask her opinion on something, the quality of a particular brand of coffee, whether the coming winter would be harsh, if she thought the new railroad spur would reach Silver Creek by spring. At first, Viola responded with hesitation, afraid to voice opinions she'd been taught to suppress. But Quinn listened with genuine interest, his head tilted slightly, as if weighing her words carefully. "You've got a sharp mind," he told her one afternoon as she explained why she believed the railroad would indeed reach them before summer, based on articles she'd read in newspapers sneaked from Madame Prescott's study. "Ever considered doing something with it besides hiding it under those fancy curls?" The question lingered with Viola long after Quinn had left the store. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed at the school, listening to the gentle snores of her roommate, she allowed herself to imagine a life where her thoughts and words mattered. The following Tuesday, disaster struck. Viola had been helping Mr. Pritchard reorganize the storeroom when Quinn arrived. Their conversation had been particularly animated. Discussing a book, Quinn had brought her a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that Viola had devoured in secret. The passage about self-reliance, Viola was saying, forgetting to keep her voice appropriately subdued. "It made me wonder if, Miss Harper." Madame Prescott stood in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. Behind her, Viola could see several of her classmates peering in with wide, scandalized eyes. "I came to check on your progress, only to find you engaged in inappropriate conversation with a man." Madame Prescott's voice could have frozen the desert. "Gather your things. We're returning to the school immediately." "Madam," Quinn began, but Madame Prescott cut him off with a raised hand. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume. Your reputation precedes you. I would thank you not to corrupt my students with your frontier notions." Viola felt her face burn with humiliation as Madame Prescott marched her back to the school, lecturing all the way about propriety and the dangers of familiar conversation with men of Quinn's ilk. "He's a rancher," Madame Prescott explained to the assembled girls that evening, using Viola as an object lesson. "A man who works with his hands, who has no formal education, no connections to society. The very sort of person young ladies of breeding should avoid." For 2 weeks, Viola was confined to the school grounds, permitted to join classes, but barred from the weekly excursions into town. She threw herself into her studies, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest when she thought of Quinn Blackwood and the conversations they would never finish. Then came the letter. Viola was summoned to Madame Prescott's office, where the headmistress handed her a cream-colored envelope with a wax seal. "From your stepfather," Madame Prescott explained, watching Viola with an expression that mingled satisfaction and pity. "He has arranged a match for you." Viola's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. Judge Harper's handwriting was as precise and unyielding as the man himself. "I have secured an advantageous arrangement for your future. Mr. Theodore Simmons, a colleague of considerable means and reputation, has agreed to take you as his wife. The wedding will take place in June, following your completion at Madame Prescott's establishment. I expect you to show appropriate gratitude for this opportunity to secure your position in society. Theodore Simmons." Viola knew him, a widower of 55, with thinning hair and cold eyes, who had dined at their home several times before her mother's death. He had looked at Viola then with an assessing gaze that made her skin crawl. "This is most fortunate," Madame Prescott said, misinterpreting Viola's silence for stunned joy. "Mr. Simmons is a man of standing. Your stepfather has been most generous in arranging such a match." That night, for the first time since arriving at the finishing school, Viola cried herself to sleep. The next morning, as the girls assembled for breakfast, a commotion outside drew everyone to the windows. A wagon had pulled up in front of the school, and Quinn Blackwood was climbing down from the driver's seat, dressed in what appeared to be his finest clothes, still rugged by Eastern standards, but clean and pressed. "What is the meaning of this?" Madam Prescott demanded, sweeping onto the porch as Quinn approached. "Morning, madam," Quinn said, removing his hat. "I've come to speak with Miss Harper, if that's acceptable." "It most certainly is not," Madam Prescott replied. "Miss Harper is not receiving visitors." "Then I'd like to speak with you, madam, about a matter concerning Miss Harper's education." Viola watched from the window as Madam Prescott reluctantly led Quinn into her office. The other girls buzzed with excitement and speculation, while Viola's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. 20 minutes later, Madam Prescott emerged from her office, her face unreadable as she approached Viola. "It seems, Miss Harper, that Mr. Blackwood has made an unusual proposal. He has offered to fund a scholarship for deserving students at our establishment." She paused, clearly conflicted. "In exchange, he has requested permission to court you properly, with appropriate chaperonage, of course." A murmur ran through the assembled girls. Viola stood frozen, unable to believe what she was hearing. "I informed him that you are already promised in marriage," Madam Prescott continued. "However, he was persistent in his request to speak with you directly on the matter. My stepfather arranged the match without consulting me," Viola said, finding her voice at last. "Surely I have some say in my future?" Madam Prescott's lips thinned. "The choice of a husband is traditionally the father's prerogative, Miss Harper. However," she glanced toward her office, where Quinn waited, "Mr. Blackwood has made a compelling case for allowing you a conversation. You may have 15 minutes, in the parlor, with Miss Winters as chaperone." Quinn stood as Viola entered the parlor, his hat in his hands. He looked different somehow, not just the clean clothes, but a quiet determination in his stance. "Miss Harper," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "Mr. Blackwood," Viola replied, conscious of Miss Winters taking a seat in the corner, her embroidery in hand, but her attention clearly on them. "I understand you've made an offer to the school." "I have," Quinn confirmed, gesturing for Viola to sit before taking a chair across from her. "But that's not why I'm here." "Not really. Then why are you here?" Quinn leaned forward, his voice low but clear enough for Miss Winters to hear every word. "Because in the weeks we've talked, I've come to know a woman with a mind sharper than any I've encountered. Because every time you speak, you say something worth hearing, even though they've tried to teach you that you should be silent. Because I believe you deserve more than being sold off to some old man who'll never appreciate who you really are." Viola glanced at Miss Winters, who was pretending great interest in her needlework while clearly hanging on every word. "How did you know about Mr. Simmons?" Viola asked. "Small town," Quinn replied with a slight shrug. "Word travels. I know he's a man of means and position. I can't offer you that kind of security." "What can you offer?" The boldness of her own question surprised Viola. Quinn smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "A partnership. Respect. The freedom to speak your mind and use that brain of yours for more than selecting ribbons. I'm not a wealthy man, but I've got good land, and I work hard. Most importantly, I promise I'll never ask you to keep your head down or your thoughts to yourself." "Mr. Blackwood," Miss Winters interrupted, "this is most irregular." Quinn nodded acknowledgement, but kept his eyes on Viola. "I'm not asking for an answer today. I know you've been taught that a man like me isn't worthy of a lady's consideration. All I'm asking is the chance to prove otherwise. My stepfather has already decided," Viola said, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. "With all due respect, Miss Harper, your stepfather isn't the one who has to live with the decision." Quinn rose to his feet, their brief time already nearly elapsed. "I'll be at the Independence Day celebration next week. If you'd like to continue our conversation properly chaperoned, of course I'd be honored." After he left, Viola returned to her room, her mind spinning. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life different from the one laid out for her, a life where she was valued for her mind rather than her docility. That evening, she wrote 2 letters. The first, to her stepfather, was polite but firm, requesting that he reconsider the arrangement with Mr. Simmons until they could discuss the matter in person. The second was shorter, addressed to Quinn Blackwood, accepting his invitation to the Independence Day celebration. Miss Winters, surprisingly, offered to deliver the second letter herself. "He speaks to you like you matter," she said quietly as she tucked the envelope into her reticule. "In all my years here, I've never seen that." The week that followed was the longest of Viola's life. Her stepfather's reply arrived, terse and unyielding. The arrangement with Mr. Simmons was final, and he expected her compliance as repayment for the years of support he'd provided since her mother's death. Madame Prescott, upon reading the letter, summoned Viola to her office. "Your stepfather's wishes are clear," she said, though her tone lacked its usual certainty. "Mr. Simmons will provide you with a respectable position in society. A position where I'll be expected to keep my head down and my mouth shut," Viola replied, surprising herself with her candor. Madame Prescott studied her for a long moment. "That is the way of the world for women, Miss Harper. We adapt to it, or we suffer the consequences. Is that why you started this school? To teach girls to disappear into the background of their own lives?" Instead of the reprimand Viola expected, Madame Prescott sighed, suddenly looking older and more tired. "I started this school because I had no other options. My own father made a poor match for me, a man who squandered my dowry and left me destitute when he died. This school has been my salvation and my prison." She straightened her shoulders. "The world does not reward women who speak their minds, Miss Harper." "Perhaps it's time it learned to," Viola said softly. A ghost of a smile touched Madame Prescott's lips. "Perhaps. But change comes slowly, and the price is often high." She picked up Viola's stepfather's letter. "Judge Harper will arrive the day after tomorrow to escort you back to Phoenix, where Mr. Simmons awaits. Whatever decision you make it with full awareness of the consequences." The Independence Day celebration had transformed Silver Creek's Main Street into a riot of color and sound. Flags hung from every building. Tables laden with food lined the thoroughfare, and a makeshift dance floor had been erected in front of the town hall. Viola walked among the festivities with Miss Winters at her side, acutely aware that this might be her last taste of freedom before her stepfather arrived to claim her the following day. "There he is," Miss Winters murmured, nodding toward the far end of the street where Quinn stood talking with several men, his tall frame easy to spot in the crowd. As if sensing her gaze, Quinn looked up, his face lighting with a smile that made Viola's heart skip. He excused himself from his companions and made his way toward them, threading through the crowd with purpose but without hurry. "Miss Harper," he said, removing his hat. "Miss Winters. Happy Independence Day to you both." "Mr. Blackwood," Viola replied, suddenly uncertain now that the moment had arrived. "Thank you for the invitation." "The pleasure is mine," Quinn said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Would you care to walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you." With Miss Winters following at a discreet distance, Quinn led Viola to a quieter area near the church, where a small group had gathered around an older man with a printer's apron. "Miss Harper, this is Morris Campbell, editor of the Silver Creek Sentinel," Quinn introduced them. "Morris, this is Miss Viola Harper, the young lady I mentioned." "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Harper," Campbell said, shaking her hand with ink-stained fingers. "Quinn here tells me you've got a way with words and opinions worth sharing." Viola looked at Quinn in confusion. "Mr. Campbell is looking for someone to write a column for the women of Silver Creek," Quinn explained. "Articles about the issues that matter to them, beyond recipes and fashion." "And you suggested me?" Viola asked, astonished. "I mentioned there was a young lady at Madame Prescott's with keen insights and a fresh perspective," Quinn said. "The rest would be entirely up to you and Mr. Campbell." The printer nodded. "Not much pay to start, mind you. But if the column takes off, who knows? Newspapers back east are starting to feature women writers. No reason Silver Creek should be behind the times." For a moment, Viola couldn't speak. The possibility of her words reaching beyond her own thoughts, of her ideas being valued and shared, was more than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. "My stepfather is arriving tomorrow," she finally said. "He's arranged a marriage for me in Phoenix." Quinn's expression darkened, but he didn't interrupt. "I see," Campbell said. "Well, the offer stands if your circumstances change, Miss Harper. Quinn speaks highly of your intelligence, and that's recommendation enough for me." As they walked away, Viola felt a curious mixture of gratitude and despair. "That was very kind of you," she said to Quinn. "But I'm afraid it's an opportunity one won't be able to pursue." Unless you decide not to go with your stepfather tomorrow, Quinn said quietly. Viola stopped walking. What other choice do I have? He's my legal guardian until I marry. I have no money, no home of my own. You could have a home with me, Quinn said simply. Not as some silent, obedient wife, but as a partner. And you could write for the Sentinel, build a name for yourself. My stepfather would never allow it. He wouldn't have to allow it if we were already married. The boldness of the suggestion took Viola's breath away. Behind them, Miss Winters pretended great interest in a nearby display of quilts, though Viola knew she was listening to every word. You're suggesting we elope? Tonight? Viola asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Quinn took her hands in his. I'm suggesting you have a choice, Viola. For maybe the first time in your life. I know we haven't known each other long, but I believe what's between us is real. I see you not just the polished young lady they're trying to create, but the woman underneath with fire in her eyes and thoughts that deserve to be heard. It would be scandalous, Viola said, though the word had already lost much of its power to frighten her. Yes, Quinn agreed. And difficult. Your stepfather would be furious. Society would talk. But you'd be free to write, to speak, to be the woman I believe you're meant to be. Viola looked down at their joined hands, his large and calloused from honest work, hers small and soft from a lifetime of being sheltered. When she looked up again, her decision was made. Yes, she said, feeling as though she was stepping off a cliff and learning to fly in the same moment. Yes, I'll marry you tonight. Miss Winters, abandoning all pretense of not listening, stepped forward. Are you certain, Viola? This is unprecedented. I'm certain, Viola said, and was surprised to find it was true. More certain than I've ever been about anything. Miss Winters nodded slowly. Then I suppose, as your chaperone, I should accompany you to ensure everything is proper. A smile tugged at her lips. As proper as an elopement can be, that is. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Quinn arranged for the town's judge to perform the ceremony that evening. Viola returned briefly to the school to gather her few personal possessions, leaving a letter for Madame Prescott explaining her decision. Miss Winters, in an unexpected show of support, helped her dress in her best gown and arranged her hair with trembling fingers. I always wanted more for my girls than the futures laid out for them, Miss Winters confessed as she pinned the last curl in place. But I never had the courage to encourage it. It isn't too late, Viola said, grasping the older woman's hand. Not for any of us. As the sun set over Silver Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Viola Harper became Viola Blackwood in a simple ceremony in Judge Peterson's parlor. Quinn had found flowers somewhere, wild daisies and desert blossoms that Miss Winters arranged into a small bouquet. When they exchanged vows, Quinn's voice was steady and sure, his eyes never leaving hers as he promised to cherish and respect her all the days of their lives. You may kiss your bride, Judge Peterson said, closing his book with a smile. Quinn's kiss was gentle but held a promise of passion that made Viola's cheeks flush and her heart race. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment. No more keeping your head down, he whispered. Not ever again. They spent their wedding night in Quinn's wagon, beneath a canopy of stars, miles from Silver Creek on the road to his ranch. Their coming together was tender and awkward and beautiful, full of whispered words and tentative touches that grew more confident as the night deepened. I never imagined this, Viola confessed as they lay entwined beneath the blankets, the desert night cool around them. A life where I could speak and be heard, where I could be myself without apology. Quinn traced the curve of her cheek with calloused fingers. That's all I want to give you, Viola. The freedom to be exactly who you are. The ranch that became Viola's new home was modest but promising, a solid house with a wide porch, a barn, and fields that stretched toward distant mountains. Quinn had built most of it himself over the past year, planning and preparing for a future he hadn't been sure would include a wife. It needs a woman's touch, he admitted as he carried her across the threshold the next day. But it's sturdy, and there's room to grow. It's perfect, Viola said, meaning it. After years in her stepfather's grand but cold house and the austere confines of Madame Prescott's school, the simple, honest warmth of the ranch house felt like freedom. Judge Harper arrived in Silver Creek to find his stepdaughter gone and a new bride in her place. His fury was legendary. He threatened legal action, public disgrace, even had the sheriff ride out to the ranch to confirm Viola was there of her own free will. Sheriff Thomas Dawson, a weathered man with kind eyes, had stood on their porch and asked Viola directly, "Miss Harper, Mrs. Blackwood, I should say, are you here by choice? You can speak freely." Viola had stood tall beside her husband. "I am exactly where I choose to be, Sheriff. By my husband's side, as his equal partner." The sheriff had nodded, satisfied. "That's good enough for me. And it'll have to be good enough for the judge, too." Eventually, Judge Harper's fury burned itself out, especially after Mr. Simmons quickly found another, younger bride from a family more desperate for connection to his wealth and status. The scandal of Viola's elopement faded as Silver Creek found newer, more interesting topics to discuss, like the surprising success of the women's column in the Sentinel, written by a Mrs. V. Blackwood, whose forthright discussions of women's education, property rights, and role in the developing West Territory found an eager audience not just in Silver Creek, but in surrounding communities as well. 6 months after their wedding, as winter settled over the ranch, Viola sat at the small desk Quinn had built for her, finishing her latest column. Through the window, she could see her husband in the yard, chopping wood for the stove, his breath fogging in the cold air. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and smiled, that same warm smile that had first made her feel seen. Viola smiled back, then returned to her writing, the words flowing freely now that she knew they would be heard. Later that evening, as they sat before the fire, Quinn reading aloud from a book of poetry while Viola mended one of his shirts, a knock at the door startled them both. Quinn answered it to find Madame Prescott standing on their porch, looking smaller somehow without the imposing backdrop of her school. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said formally when Viola appeared behind Quinn, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion." "Of course," Viola said, recovering from her surprise. "Please, coming out of the cold." Over cups of strong coffee, Madame Prescott explained her unexpected visit. "I've been reading your columns, Mrs. Blackwood. They've given me much to think about regarding the education we provide at the school." "I never meant to criticize your establishment specifically," Viola began, but Madame Prescott waved her apology away. "No, you were right to question our methods. We've been teaching girls to disappear rather than to thrive." She placed her cup carefully on its saucer. "I've come to ask if you would consider returning to the school not as a student, but as an instructor, to teach our girls how to think, not just how to behave." Viola looked at Quinn, who nodded his encouragement. "I would be honored," she said, "though I have much to learn myself." "Don't we all?" Madame Prescott replied with a hint of a smile. "Perhaps that's the most important lesson we can teach." As winter gave way to spring, Viola divided her time between the ranch, her writing, and her new role at the school. The girls, initially shocked by her unconventional marriage and career, soon came to admire her independence and intelligence. Even Judge Harper, during a brief, stiff visit to the ranch, had to acknowledge that his stepdaughter had found a life of substance, if not the social standing he'd envisioned for her. "He still speaks to you like you hang the moon," her former classmate Rose commented one afternoon, watching Quinn and Viola interact during a school picnic. After nearly a year of marriage. "He speaks to me like I matter," Viola corrected her, though she smiled as she watched her husband demonstrating the proper way to throw a lasso to an enthusiastic group of students. "Like my thoughts are worth hearing." "Is that the secret?" Rose asked wistfully. "To finding happiness in marriage." Viola considered the question seriously. "I think so. That, and finding the courage to lift your head and speak those thoughts aloud, even when the world tells you to stay silent." That evening, as they rode home together, Viola told Quinn she was expecting their first child. His whoop of joy echoed across the valley, startling a flock of birds from a nearby tree. "Are you happy?" he asked later, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach as they lay in bed. "With this life we've built." Viola placed her hand over his. "Happier than I ever imagined possible. You gave me a voice when everyone else wanted me silent." "No," Quinn corrected gently. "You always had a voice, Viola. I just had the good sense to listen." In the years that followed, the Blackwood Ranch prospered, as did the family that called it home. Their first child, a daughter with her father's steady gaze and her mother's quick mind, was joined by two brothers who grew up believing that the most valuable thing they could offer another person was their full attention and respect. Viola's column expanded into a regular newspaper of her own, the Western Woman's Advocate, which circulated throughout the territory. Madame Prescott's school, under her continued influence, evolved into an academy that prepared young women not just for marriage, but for lives of purpose and independence. And through it all, Quinn remained at Viola's side, her staunchest supporter and most attentive listener. Each evening, no matter how busy the day had been, they would sit together on the porch as the sun set over their land, sharing the thoughts and dreams that others might have deemed unimportant. "Do you ever regret it?" Viola asked on their 10th anniversary, as they watched their children playing in the yard. "Marrying a woman who refuses to keep her head down?" Quinn laughed, the sound as warm and genuine as it had been the first day in Pritchard's store. "Only a fool would want to silence the smartest person he knows." He took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Besides, I fell in love with your mind first. Everything else was just a bonus." Viola leaned against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that she had found not just a husband, but a man who valued her for exactly who she was: curious mind, strong opinions, and all. "Speaking of which," Quinn added, "I read your latest editorial. The one about women's suffrage. Powerful stuff, Mrs. Blackwood. You think people are ready to hear it?" "Whether they're ready or not, it's worth saying." He squeezed her hand. "And you're worth hearing." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Viola Blackwood looked out over the life she'd built, a life she'd once been too afraid to even imagine. A life where she never had to keep her head down or her thoughts to herself. A life where she was heard, valued, and loved, not despite her voice but because of it. And in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just freedom, but the courage to use it well. 25 years after that fateful Independence Day, when she'd chosen to rewrite her own story, Viola stood on the steps of the Silver Creek Courthouse, surrounded by women of all ages. Her daughter Emma, now a teacher at what had once been Madame Prescott's finishing school and was now the Western Women's Academy, stood proudly at her side. Her sons, both grown and working the expanded Blackwood Ranch with their father, waited in the crowd with supportive smiles. And Quinn, his hair now streaked with silver, but his eyes still bright with the same light that had first made her feel truly seen, watched from the front row as his wife addressed the gathering. "For too long, we were told to keep our heads down." Viola's voice rang out clear and strong across the town square. "To speak only when spoken to accept the limitations placed upon us without question. But today, as Arizona prepares to enter the Union as the 15th state to grant women the right to vote, we stand with our heads held high, ready to make our voices heard not just in our homes, but in the governance of our communities and our nation." The crowd erupted in cheers, and as Viola stepped down from the podium, Quinn was the first to embrace her. "Not bad for a girl who was supposed to keep her head down," he murmured against her hair. Viola smiled up at him, her heart as full as it had been on their wedding day. "I had a good teacher in the art of speaking up." "No." Quinn shook his head, his eyes filled with pride and love. "You taught yourself. I just had the privilege of listening." That night, as they had done every night for 25 years, they sat together on their porch, sharing the day's thoughts beneath a canopy of stars. Their children were grown, their ranch prosperous, their lives rich with purpose and connection. And at the center of it all was the simple, revolutionary act that had started everything: a man who chose to listen, and a woman who found the courage to speak. "Do you know what tomorrow is?" Quinn asked, his arm around her shoulders. Viola nodded. 25 years since the day we met. Since you first spoke to me in Pritchard's store." "Best decision I ever made," Quinn said, looking past that downturned head to find the woman beneath. "And the best decision I ever made was looking up," Viola replied softly, "to find the man who thought I was worth hearing." In the distance, coyotes called to one another across the desert, their voices rising and falling in the ancient conversation of the wild. Above them, stars wheeled in their eternal dance, witnessing the small miracle of two people who had found in each other not just love, but the freedom to be fully themselves. And Viola Blackwood, who had once been taught to keep her head down and her thoughts to herself, lifted her face to the sky with a heart full of gratitude for the life she'd been brave enough to claim and for the man who had helped her find her voice by simply believing it deserved to be heard.